Right, so first of all, I want to thank the FSA for inviting me here to the Isle of Man. Last time I was here was back in 2010, I believe, and it has changed a fair bit. But I must say, as I was landing here yesterday, I thought, wow, it's changed a fair bit. It's really beautiful. I could see the coast. And then this morning I woke up pouring down and I went, yeah. That's how I remember the Isle of Man. So I'm glad that not a lot has changed. So I'm here to talk about proliferation finance. I'm here to unpack it. And I must say that yesterday, as we're chatting about PF with the lovely people I met for the first time yesterday, there's two words that came up. PF is nebulous. And Terry... And I did warn you I was going to steal it from you. Terry called it the unicorn of jurisdictions. And I thought he's spot on. So I find it quite interesting that the first FATF reports or guidance that came out on PF was actually back in 2008. And yet here we are in 2025, still calling it nebulous, still calling it, so it's quite a mystery, isn't it? So what I'd like to do today is to hopefully, in the next 25 minutes, unpack PF a little bit. And the way I'll be doing it is by referring to the following documents. So obviously, I'm sure that all of you have come across the FATF guidance on PF. Back in June, the FATF published this complex proliferation financing and sanctions evasion schemes report, which was quite interesting, sort of really ensured that there was a lot of consultation done across the private sector, across civil societies, practitioners, to really feed into this report. And it had actually quite interesting recommendations, which I'll talk about briefly today. I also will be referring to three documents that I had the pleasure to work on, two of them as my quality as associate fellow at RUSI, where we looked at interviewing a number of financial institutions to really understand what their challenges were when it came to implementing proliferation finance, or counter-proliferation finance, should I say, as well as tackling sanctions evasion, because that's something that comes up a lot, right? Which is, well, what's the difference between sanctions evasion and PF? What's the difference between PF and money laundering? And actually, I was really taken aback by what you were saying, DQ, earlier around, the different steps of money laundering, because you'll see actually that what you're describing in terms of the different steps of ML is similar or very much aligned to the three steps of PF. So it really isn't a surprise that we are really struggling to understand what PF looks like. What is it as risk practitioners that we should be looking out for? And I'll be talking as well about a sort of a quick and dirty summary of this risk assessment methodology that I developed for RUSI, and a bit of a drill down that I created for the EOCN in Dubai. So hopefully that will come in handy in terms of helping us unpacking and understanding what PF is. So my first question is, how do you go from having items such as those to having this? So programs of weapons of mass destruction. What's the process? Because obviously you need to have access to dual use goods, which is what we saw in the previous slide. But how does it work? And this is where I come in. Because obviously I'm not, I say obviously you don't all know me, but I'm not an export control expert. I'm not an engineer either, but I do understand a little bit about finance, and I do understand how actually you go from the previous slide to what it is that we're having right here. And it's really all about the financing. It is really how you go about it. So at RUSI, or at the Center for Finance and Security, we've come up with a way of unpacking what PF is. And actually, it is sort of slightly wider than what the FATF defines PF to be. So first, of course, it's really about, trading or providing financial products, financial services that are going to be associated to the trade in proliferation-sensitive goods, as well as proliferation technologies. There's also this aspect of raising the revenues. And what's interesting when you look at PF is that those revenues are being raised. Of course, they're going to be done by what we call the state actors. So DPRK, North Korea, Iran, but there's also financiers, intermediaries that are supporting those state actors as well as non-state actors, unfortunately. So the likes of Abdul Qadir Khan, for instance, who is a known financier and intermediary. And those activities are going to support those different actors. And what's interesting to note is that most of the time, those activities look like completely legitimate activities. As an institution, it looks like you're providing trade finance. The moment you have this nexus with the DPRK, that's when it becomes illegal. So nothing wrong, for instance, with financing, a building. The latest construction on Victoria Road, you may say, nothing wrong with that. But the moment that there's a nexus with the DPRK, that is actually a violation of UNSCR 1718. And finally, PF is also about providing the infrastructure, financial infrastructure, corporate infrastructure to different actors that will ultimately support Category 1 and Category 2 on this pyramid. So all those financial services, so for instance, as a TCSP, you're providing services to a financier or proliferation financier, you are ultimately providing proliferation finance. If I'm opening an account for an individual who is a diplomat in the North Korean embassy, there is a risk, but of course that's something that we can unpack later over a pint, that you are ultimately violating UNSCRs or the United Nations recommendations. The reason as well that PF can be quite challenging is that some of my colleagues, some of my co-experts tell me, well, actually, if you are selling a violin to the niece of Kim Jong-un, you are actually providing, you are supporting PF. And I'm like, really? And we really have those debates. So this is how insidious PF can be. So ultimately, what are the objectives of proliferation financier? It's very simple. They want money. This is what it's all about. They also want to acquire the know-how. So, for instance, I come from France. We've got quite an advanced nuclear industry there. So that is something that we need to be aware of. That is one of our vulnerabilities in my jurisdiction. They need operational support. So when you're talking about those networks of money launderers, those professional networks, that's what proliferation financiers are after as well. They need to, of course, have access to the private sector. I mean, you will recall a few slides ago, I showed you an aluminium sheet. I showed you an CNLCT. I mean, ultimately, those are things that cost money. And actually, those products are provided by completely legitimate private companies that have, of course, bank accounts with legit financial institutions. When you are purchasing those goods, you need and you want to have access to that network. And you want to purchase, of course, sensitive and dual-use goods. That's what it's all about. So to break it down, you want to raise, so you have those fundraising activities that are really varied. So it could be opening a fishery in Mozambique, for instance. It could be hacking by bits. So the Lazarus group that works for the DPRK this year hacked $1.5 billion. That is part of their revenue raising activities. It could be about gold smuggling. It could be engaging into illegal wildlife trade. There's all sorts of items. And actually, now I'm thinking of it, it could be providing very experienced IT workers to companies in the US. That is one of the typologies that was very well, I mean, even my mother heard about it. I mean, that's how widely communicated that was. And you want to move this money because, at the moment, for instance, we know that North Korea was sitting on 1.5 billion worth of crypto assets, and they have actually been able to off-ramp or convert this $300 million worth of those crypto into fiat money. So that's also about, moving those funds. And then finally, of course, you want to procure the goods. You want to be able to build uranium enrichment facilities. You want to be able to build sonic super missiles, etc., etc. And the techniques of obfuscation, and this is why it's really relevant to the private sector, are varied. And whoever we talk to, and it could be those fisheries in the south of the African continent, it could be to the TCSPs here in the room, it could be to funds in Luxembourg. There's such a wide array of obfuscation tactics that we could unpack that ultimately we are all vulnerable to proliferation finance. And that's why we really need to be able to almost sort of change the chip that we have and add PF to our MLTF framework. So a little bit of context. So the FATF came out with this report back in, couple of months ago. Ultimately, and it goes back to what I was saying when I started talking, 2008. First FATF report came out, and jurisdictions still struggle to understand what PF is all about and what PF risk is and what it means for their institutions. And we know with the current geopolitical landscape that we're living in, that the landscape is fast shifting. And with the last round of mutual evaluations, and of course, we've been talking a lot about the next round of evaluations, PF risk assessment is something that is at the forefront of many, many jurisdictions whose evaluations are coming up 2026 onwards. And of course, what's important to know, just a little bit of context, is the FATF recommendations. So recommendation 1 around, of course, risk assessment and what it means for the private sector, what it means for VASPs, what it means for DNFBPs, what it means for FI. So having this real understanding at the institutional level what PF risk is, up to recommendation 7 relating to targeted financial sanctions. So those are the key elements that the FATF is focusing on. And in terms of threats, well, we know that the DPRK remains a threat. It continues to develop WMD capability, or weapons of mass destruction capability. We have evidence that North Korea has been going ahead with nuclear testing, ballistic testing. So that is an issue. What's interesting, of course, is that the DPRK is incredibly agile. So it's not bothering with the MOUs, memorandums of understandings, with MLATs, none of that. It is incredibly agile and is able to actually shift its typologies and its techniques very fast. And so to give you an example, I've really recently wrapped up a project looking at the overlay between North Korea and how it's potentially working with organized crime groups and what potential links are with scam centers. So actually, I'm very fortunate because the speakers today, so Ian, DQ, really been setting the scene for me. But that's how agile they are. They're really able to really sort of target a number of different partners. And we know that, of course, they've sort of set up their strategic partnership treaty with Russia. And so that's quite interesting as well. A point to raise is this sort of shift into the landscape. And what's important to note is that some jurisdictions I've been working with are not considering Russia as a threat because they're looking at proliferation finance strictly in this sort of FATF framework. But ultimately, I think it's very short-termist, and that is something that we need to be aware of. So as well as Iran, that is a known issue, and that's something that I want to talk about in about 2 seconds' time. Russia is a continued threat, and that's something that we need to consider, and we need to understand how our profiles is potentially exposing us to PF through the Russian nexus. So Iran is more of a well-known fact, more documented in terms of its dealings with transnational organized criminals. This has been observed in the US, for instance, notably. We know that there is extensive use of military proxies in the Middle East. But I think something that I really want to talk about, and it's a bit of the sort of elephant in the room when you're looking at sort of the FPF, it's this regulatory ambiguity that is associated to Iran. So under the UNSCR 2231, of course, Iran was sanctioned, but there was the sunset of this UNSCR in October of last year, and technically in October of 2025, so, in 1 month's time, technically speaking, the UNSCR 2231 will no longer apply. Now, allegedly, there's this what we call the snapback mechanism. France, UK, and Germany has sent a letter saying, well, actually, we want UNSCR 2231 to come back in. But this ambiguity, this uncertainty is actually an issue for a number of jurisdictions. So some jurisdictions I'm working with in the Middle East that have dealings with Iran are telling us, well, where are we at? What should we do? What does it mean for our PF risk assessment? And some of the banks are like, well, what do we do? We're actually, financing X, Y, and Z for some nationals. So that there's this regulatory ambiguity when we're looking at PF is something that is counterproductive and is a real issue for the private sector as well as for the public sector. And then I'm sure that some of you will have seen in the news this picture from yesterday of Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping, as well as Putin, all gathered in Tiananmen Square. And so we can see that Russia is actually expanding its military collaboration with the DPRK. We've seen some North Korean soldiers in Ukraine, deployed in Ukraine, and that evidences that ultimately we have a real shift into our PF landscape. And the question is, okay, well, what does it mean? What are the implications moving forward? So I will skip quite quickly because I'm conscious of time. I know I've got about 7 minutes left. It's a lot to unpack here. But ultimately, we know that when we're looking at vulnerabilities, weak governance, weak enforcement, a weak export control regime is going to be an issue. We know that if you're, as an institution, exposed to organized crime, exposed to corruption, exposed to other type of criminal activities, you are ultimately, those are sort of the cheval de Troy horse, I think that's a word as well in English, of proliferation finance in your jurisdiction. And we know that if you have a lack of culture when it comes to cooperation between the public and the private sector, this as well is an issue for PF. So the FATF, and actually as well from my work as a consultant, VASPs, the real estate sector, DNFBPs, and the maritime sector are typically targeted by proliferation finance intermediaries, by the financiers. Why is that? Because in a number of jurisdictions, there's a low level of awareness of PF risk. There's also, Nikesh, you were making a point this morning about the antiques market, which actually is something that I was hearing 10 years ago or 15 years ago in financial institutions. We are not the police. How do we deal with it's embarrassing asking for due diligence when we're doing onboarding. So that's interesting. So there is a lack of compliance culture in some DNFBPs, and that is an issue. That is a layer that needs to be unpeeled. There's also all those actors enable complex and wide movement of funds, which really feeds back into the slide I talked to you through a few minutes ago around the different techniques of obfuscation. So it's accumulation of factors that make specific sectors particularly vulnerable to proliferation finance. And of course, IFCs, international financial centers, and financial hub are likely to be vulnerable to proliferation finance because of the sheer volume of transactions, because of the cross-border element of it, because of the presence, of course, of banking and financial services, but not just IFCs, of course. So the crypto asset ecosystem is an issue, and of course, we've seen a lot over-the-counter OTCs or VASP over-the-counter traders facilitating proliferation finances in their efforts to actually move funds and procure goods. The having a particularly developed maritime and shipping industry is also something that is likely to be attractive to proliferation financiers, and as well as the presence of a rich dual-use good industry. So something, for instance, that we have in France or Germany. So ultimately, what I would like to say is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So yes, proliferation finance is a potential threat to your exercises, to your activities. But what is reassuring ultimately is that you do not have to reinvent the wheels. The framework that you have in place will enable you to fight it. And the only issue, I think, is having the ability to really sort of switch that ship, if you will. But the other problem as well, the key challenge that we do have is that we don't have sufficient data yet to help us truly understand what the difference is, or how you know that a specific alert is actually telling you that this is PF rather than this is money laundering. And that is a key challenge that was raised by the FATF, but I have actually observed myself in my day-to-day activities, supporting jurisdictions and supporting some financial institutions. What is it that we are looking at? And we could talk about the root cause of that, but unfortunately, in the next 2 minutes, I won't be able to do that, but I'll be delighted to talk about this afterwards. So, what I want to really highlight, the key takeaway before I walk off the stage, is that we have, as risk practitioners within the private sector, the ability to set the narrative and to almost educate our regulators in some jurisdictions about what PF looks like. You are at the forefront. You are the ones who are dealing with alerts. You're dealing with clients. You're dealing with products. And this is the chance to be able to develop adequate targeted questionnaires to start gathering that data that will then feed into your institutional risk assessments as well as your PF risk assessments moving forward. And very quickly, just to conclude, I invite you, if you're interested about PF and you wonder, okay, well, what does it mean, Noémi? It's all very good. You've been standing here for 25 minutes trying to unpack PF, but what does it mean practically speaking? I'm more than happy to go through this questionnaire, send it to you so you can unpack it and really help you understand, okay, when I'm onboarding a customer, how can I spot, how can I identify PF? How is this individual exposing my institution to PF? And this particular questionnaire is one of 3. So I've developed a questionnaire for financial institutions, I've developed one for DNFBPs, and I've developed one for VASPs. And of course, today, Liam was saying that, risk and risk assessments live. It's a moving a beast almost. So that came out a couple of years ago. If you feel that there's anything that is misrepresentative, that something is lacking, please, I'm around, come and talk to me, because like I always say, actually, we are a room full of experts, and I'm really looking forward to learning from you all. Thank you very much.